For those of you that haven't met me, I'm Mike. I am the social studies teacher, and for the time being, instead of doing a second math class, I will be doing science in the afternoons at 1:15. So you'll see me for both of those classes. And if you are watching this on the YouTube channel or the Facebook page, earlier recording, or in other words, you're not watching live, and you've never met me, my name is Mike. You'll see me every day for social studies and for science. So without too much more introduction, I will go ahead and get started. We are going to pick up where we left off yesterday and talk about some civics and government stuff. So let me pull this up here. While I get things going here. Chat, make sure I have it up and running. Give me just a second here. Hey, Caleb.
Yep.
How do so I've got my screen share, and for some reason when I go to chat, I can't see the box. I like to just have it up just so I make sure I'm kind of keeping an eye on it. Am I missing something?
Did you click the chat button at the bottom?
Yeah, I did.
And it's not on your screen?
Right.
Huh. So
it's not a big deal. It's not a big deal. I can mess with it later. I just was wondering if I was just missing something easy, and I'll just power through it. So I won't see your chat here for the time being, but again, if you have any questions, just direct them to Caleb, and hopefully then we can get you squared away. So yesterday we started talking about civics and government, and we talked about types of governments. Today we're going to focus on our government, the United States government, and some of the early U.S. history around the setting up of the U.S. government. So this first screen shows a copy of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And again, if we were in a group setting, we would maybe talk about the differences between the two, but it may sound straightforward, but a lot of people actually kind of don't necessarily know what are. They've all heard of them, but the Declaration of Independence is exactly what it sounds like. It's simply the United States decision to declare or decide to be an independent nation apart from Great Britain or the King of England. So that came prior to the United States actually becoming a country, and prior to the American Revolution. After the Revolution won and the United States was indeed its own country, then we had to come up with a system or a set of guidelines to help function or help govern the new nation and what it was going to look like. And that was ultimately what the Constitution was. So today we're going to talk about mostly the Constitution and also the Articles of Confederation, which I will explain in just a minute. So there's a lot of information on this screen. I'm not going to go through all of it. I'm going to focus more on this bottom section here, the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. And I will try my best to go slowly through some of this. Since it feels like a little bit like I'm talking to myself, I have a tendency of probably talking too much and too fast, so I apologize ahead of time for that. But again, I'll try my best to kind of slow things down and go through them step by step. So the Articles of Confederation were actually our country's first attempt at setting up a constitution, setting up a form of government. And we actually set our country up as what we call a confederacy. In other words, a loose alliance of states without a national government overseeing everything. So essentially what that means was, or meant was, all 13 original states had their own governments and essentially operated independently of one another and came to an agreement on certain things once in a while, but they didn't have a federal government or a national government, I should say, overseeing everything that the state did. So down on the bottom, the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, or the reason it didn't last very long, and we'll get into how long it lasted in a minute, but essentially the Articles of Confederation and the first attempt at running a country were failed. The United States was losing money, they didn't have control over anything, and it was just overall kind of a mess, right? And so part of the reason for the failure of the Articles of Confederation was, first of all, a weak national government, right? And so while people in government today still debate, how much power the national government should or shouldn't have, one thing has been proven is that the national government has to have some amount of power, because if they don't have any power or they have too little power, then there's not enough infrastructure to successfully run a country the size of the United States. Right? So a weak national government was kind of the first big weakness. The next one here, Congress could not tax or regulate commerce among states. So even though taxes aren't something that we all like or enjoy paying, right? Without taxes, the country doesn't have the funds or the capacity to operate, right? So the country has to be generating money, and the United States wasn't generating nearly enough money because they didn't have a system in place where they could tax or regulate things that were going on in each state. Another issue was there was no common currency, right? So every state had different money, and that caused complications when people would try to interact with people from other states, obviously. There were just one vote per state, and size didn't matter. So what we mean by that is there was essentially a Congress, right? Every state had one representative, so there were 13 representatives, and they all had an equal say in what went on, despite some colonies, or not colonies, states now, some states having much more people and being much bigger, and some being much smaller with much fewer people. So obviously, people from bigger states felt like they were being underrepresented because they got the same say as somebody from a little state. It would be like today if people from California got the same amount of representation as the people from Alaska, right? Population-wise, those are two dramatically different things. And then the last one is that there were no executive or judicial branches of the government. There was just the legislative branch. So in other words, we didn't have the president and the cabinet. We didn't have the Supreme Court. There weren't those things in place. And again, there was just not enough infrastructure to successfully run a country. And we found that out the hard way because we were going under as a country, right? So you don't have to, again, there's a lot of stuff on these slides. Just do your best to look through them, but don't obsess about it. You don't need to be like frantically taking notes. You don't need to be doing that. But so anyway, just to kind of recap this slide as best I can, the first attempt at government fails, and kind of try again, right? So the Articles of Confederation are this first attempt, and then 11 years later, so 1791, we actually passed the Constitution as we know it today, and it shifted our form of government from a confederacy to federalism, where you have kind of a shared power between nation and state. So in other words, today, states do have a lot of power and a lot of authority in certain areas. And we'll kind of get into that tomorrow when we talk about levels and branches of the government. But in federalism, states do have a lot of autonomy or freedom and power to do things, but they also share that power with a powerful national government, right? It isn't like a confederation where the states have power and the federal government doesn't have any or has very little. It's a shared power. Okay? And so Again, the Constitution was passed in 1791, effectively ending the Articles of Confederation, and then the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the original 10 amendments, are known as the Bill of Rights. So when you hear the Bill of Rights, that's just another word for the Constitution, or the first 10 amendments. So I want to go through a little bit more stuff, and then I'll put up a couple of practice questions so you can kind of see what some easy questions talking about the Constitution might look like on the practice or on the real test. So again, if I'm boring you to death, I apologize. I'm figuring this out as we go also, as this is only our second day of doing this, so hopefully things will get a little better and I'll get a little better at doing this kind of stuff. So with that said, here are the first 10 amendments. I don't expect everyone or anyone to know all 10 or memorize all 10, but I do go over it a lot in class, and it comes up often. Everyone tends to know the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. Those are all kind of various forms of expression, right? So the freedom to express yourself how you like, right? The Second Amendment, most people know that, the right to keep and bear arms. Number 3 is where, 3 through 10 are not as common. People don't necessarily all know these things, and I'll kind of run through them and explain them the best I can, and then go from there. So the Third Amendment, no quartering of soldiers. In other words, you can't be forced to put soldiers up in your home. And that might sound silly, but 300 years ago, when the American Revolution was going on, British soldiers would come into your house and demand food and shelter and a place to sleep. And that is not constitutional or legal under the Third Amendment, right? The Fourth Amendment is the freedom from unreasonable search and seizures. So we all kind of know about if you get pulled over for a speeding ticket, that police officer doesn't have the right to look in your trunk unless you let them, right? Because there's no reasonable evidence or anything that says that there's something else going on, right? Or a police officer can't show up to your house and demand to come in and look around unless there is a warrant or some kind of reasonable evidence that they have the right to. So, Fourth Amendment, unreasonable search and seizures. The Fifth Amendment, let's see. I'm just going to read it as is here and then kind of explain it. So, officially charged for a crime, freedom from self-incrimination, no double jeopardy, right to due process, eminent domain, so on and so forth, right? Now, you've probably heard the expression, I plead the Fifth, or that's referring to the Fifth Amendment. And essentially, it's you have the right to say nothing if saying something incriminates, right? So if you are in court and saying the truth incriminates you, you have the right to say nothing, right? And with all of this stuff, I don't pretend to be an expert on it, so I try to simplify things, but I'm not an expert at all things social studies, so I try to keep it simple, and if I'm keeping it too simple, I apologize. So the Sixth Amendment are the rights of an accused person to a speedy and public trial and the right to be tried by your peers. So this is, if you're accused of a crime, you still can't be put in jail indefinitely, right? So if you're accused of a crime, you get put in jail, but then you have the right to have a scheduled hearing or a scheduled trial within a reasonable amount of time. So that you can't get thrown in jail and they keep you there for 10 years and without a trial. And so obviously, if you are arrested and accused of any criminal act, you can't be held indefinitely or for any unreasonable amount of time. Hear weird sounds over here, it's because my son is waking up from a nap. So I'm just going to kind of see if I can get him to stay quiet over here. till the end of the class, and if not, then we'll see what happens. So the Seventh Amendment is the same, but for civil cases, so not necessarily criminal cases. The Eighth Amendment, freedom from excessive bail or cruel and unusual punishments. So in other words, if you are held in jail, the amount of bail has to match the severity of the crime you're accused of, right? So if you're in there for murder, that's going to be a lot different than if you're in there being held for some misdemeanor offense, right? So bail is set accordingly, and you can't be given an excessive amount of bail for something that doesn't match. And obviously, cruel and unusual punishment is self-explanatory. And then the Ninth and 10th Amendments, other rights of the people and other powers reserved to the states. So these essentially say, so number 9 is an odd way of saying that if there are things that aren't explicitly mentioned in the Constitution, in other words, there's stuff left out, right? Then those are inherently or not inherently excluded from the Constitution. So, in other words, if something isn't expressly mentioned, there's a matter of interpretation that the Supreme Court or the court system in general is allowed to use. And the 10th Amendment is essentially trying to say that anything that isn't mentioned in the Constitution, in terms of laws or regulations, those are powers then that the states have. So anything that the national government doesn't have explicit control over inherently can be controlled by the states, right? So that's the reason why states have different laws, right? So, and that's the reason why in Washington State you can have legal marijuana, but on the national level it's illegal, and in certain states it's illegal, right? So something like that is an example of the 10th Amendment, right? Where you have states that decide certain laws should exist there that may or may not exist at a national level or in other states, okay? So that was a lot, and thank you for bearing with me on that. And so this is kind of the last slide I want to go over, and then we'll do 1 or 2 practice questions as long as we have time. We're doing all right on time. I try to be over by 11:45 because anything longer than that, I think it's just too long to be staring at your phone. So in closing, kind of the summary between, or the summary of the differences between the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution, right? So both essentially we're trying to do the same thing, set up a framework of how our government would be structured. And I'll just work from the top down. So the first thing says Articles of Confederation, unicameral, each state 1 vote, Constitution bicameral, Senate 2 votes, House of Representatives 4. So that's something we're going to talk about tomorrow. Essentially that deals with Congress. So how the Articles of Confederation had 1 body of Congress, 1 person from each state. And that was it. The Constitution has 2 separate bodies of Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives, which I'll explain in tomorrow's class. But the Senate gets 2 votes for each state. In other words, each state has 2 senators, and the House of Representatives, the other body of Congress, is actually based on population. So those bigger states get more representation in the House of Representatives. The next one, no executive officials, and obviously with the Constitution, we have a president and his cabinet, her cabinet. The Articles of Confederation, there were no judicial systems or no federal courts, no national court systems. And again, the Constitution established those. There were no taxes under the Articles of Confederation, and no federal taxes. There were state taxes. You paid your individual state taxes, but you didn't pay any federal taxes. And the Constitution allowed the national government to levy taxes or to put taxes on. Again, no trade regulations were existing under the Articles of Confederation. In other words, the national government couldn't limit states in terms of what they wanted to trade or how they wanted to trade, and the national government now has oversight when it comes to states trading internationally, right? Like Washington State can't have different trade laws than any other state. And then the last two down there, let's see, 9 out of 13 states passed laws. So in other words, the Articles of Confederation had to have 9 out of the 13 states agree to pass a law. And the new Constitution they set up was you had to have anything over 50% of the House of Representatives and the Senate, plus the president's approval to pass a law. So passing laws looks a little bit different. And then obviously the duration, the Articles of Confederation only lasted 11 years, and the Constitution is still what guides our country today. So it's been around a lot longer than we're. All right, so with that, I'm going to leave us here. So we're going to go over levels and branches of government tomorrow. Let me stop this share and put up a new chair real quick. I'm going to go over a couple practice questions in these last 10 minutes or so, and then we'll call it a day. So I'm going to share a screen, and I want to share. So let me just get a little bigger and zoom it in a little bit more. And hopefully you can see this okay. If you're looking at this on a phone, I understand that might be pretty small, but I'll do my best to kind of talk through it. So we're going to not do all these questions. I'm going to start with number 2. So if you can see number 2 clearly, go ahead and give it a read if you want. But I will, for the sake of not wanting to sit here in silence, I will also read through it myself. So number 2 says, the Constitution is a relatively brief document containing only about 7,000 words. It establishes the structure and powers of the U.S. government, but does not give many specifics. What assumption were the drafters of the Constitution working under as they kept the document general and brief? So let's read through our options, and then we'll kind of talk about it. A, there was not enough time to draft a long, detailed document before the states had to ratify it. B, most of the power of the federal government would be reserved to the president, who could govern as he saw fit. C, the details of government would be worked out in the future as the need arose within the framework of the Constitution. Written constitutions were an untested basis for democratic government, so it was better to keep such a document. All right, so a lot of words in there, a lot of reading, which again I know isn't everyone's favorite when it comes to practice questions. Again, and I will drive this home at least the first few days, but the social studies test is much more about reading content and vocabulary than it is knowledge, right? You don't need to be an expert on the U.S. Constitution to be able to answer this question, okay? So just to kind of go back to what they're asking us. What assumption were the drafters of the Constitution working under as they kept the document general and brief? So, in other words, the people that created the Constitution made it short and they made it broad. So and without saying too much, this question is essentially asking us, why do we think they did that, right? And so if I know the answer and there's a clear choice, then just go with that, right? But for the sake of practice, let's assume that we don't have a clear answer, right? To me, a couple of these stand out as being pretty poor choices. So A and D are things that I would rule out just kind of by the tone of the way that they're worded. A, there was not enough time to draft a long, detailed document before the states had ratifying. The chances are that the people that created the United States Constitution had as much time as they needed, right? So to assume that they were rushed into doing it, and that's the reason that they made it short, seems, right? At least to me. And D, written constitutions were an untested basis for democratic government, so it is better to keep such a document brief. There were lots of instances in history where we've had written constitutions. They have been a thing for a long time, and so the idea that they were new is just not true. So again, you have to have some background knowledge to know some of that, but you don't need to know anything specific about the U.S. Constitution. And right away, I've just ruled out A and D. And just now, as I'm seeing the chat pop up, make sure to enter your name in the chat so we have a timestamp of any student that is attending class, so that you get credit for attending class, because we want to make sure that we get it. So go ahead and make sure you type your full first and last name into the chat. And I see the question coming up about getting all these images. And I guess the easiest way is we will repost these videos onto our YouTube channel and our Facebook page, and you can pause and look at them in kind of whatever time you want. So it is possible to get copies of this. And if for some reason you have trouble, then just ask us. Sorry for kind of going off topic there, but back to our question. So number 2, we've essentially ruled out A and we've ruled out D. But, so B or C are essentially what we're looking for. So B, most of the power of the federal government would be reserved to the president, who could govern as he saw fit. Or C, the details of government would be worked out in the future as the need arose within the framework of the Constitution. And ultimately, the answer here is that we assume the creators of the Constitution made it short and made it broad so that things that came up that were not foreseeable in the future could be dealt with within the Constitution. So imagine creating this document 300 years ago. You have no idea what the country is going to look like today, right? You just don't. And so the fact that we're 200, right? So you just don't have that kind of foresight. But they did have the foresight and the knowledge to think, well, we don't know what it's going to look like, so let's make it general and let's make it short so that people can apply it to lots of different things that we can't think about, right? So C is the correct answer here. The details of government would be worked out in the future as the need arose within the framework of the Constitution. So let's just do one real short question here, and then we will call it a day. So we're just going to do number 3 because my son is telling me it's time to be done. So number 3 says, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected to the presidency 4 times between 1933 and 1945. In reaction to this, the 22nd Amendment, ratified in 1951, allowed presidents a maximum of 2 terms in office. So prior to 1951, presidents could be elected on 4-year terms, but they could be elected indefinitely, right? There was no law prohibiting that. But after Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected 4 times, people decided, and not because FDR wasn't popular, because he largely was, but people noticed that that could potentially be an issue. Yeah, if presidents had unlimited terms they could serve, there were potential problems with that. So we passed the 22nd Amendment, limiting presidents to 2 terms only in office. So you could only serve 8 years. So the question is asking, people who favored presidential term limits, people who were in favor of that amendment, limiting them to 2 terms, would most likely have valued which of the following? A, responsibility but no authority. B, authority but no responsibility. C, the power of an office, not an individual. And D, the power of an individual, not an office. Kind of a weird question in terms of our answer choices are kind of odd, right? But responsibility and authority don't necessarily factor into this question directly. And if I was the one solving this question, I would rule out A and B and try to see what they're asking. So let's rule it down to C and D. The power of an office, not an individual, or the power of an individual, not the office. So in other words, by placing term limits on the president, are they valuing the power of the person that's currently the president or the office of the president, right? Or the post of the president. And by not allowing people to run indefinitely, they're limiting the power of the individual. So they're actually favoring C, the power of an office, not an individual. Okay. So with that, let's stop there for the day. Sorry, we kind of got derailed towards the end. Rylan, say sorry. Your fault. Anyway, I hope that was at least somewhat helpful for you guys. If you do have questions, again, contact us through the website, email us, make sure that you ask for help, right? Because the big thing with this is we're new at this and we're trying to be as helpful as we can, but we ultimately don't know what you guys need unless you ask for it. So please ask us for help in whatever way you can. And if we're doing something that's not helpful, let us know, because we want to be helpful. That's the reason we're doing it. So anyway, thanks you guys. I will be back for science at 1:15, and Martin will be up at 12:15 with the reading class. So have a great day, and I will talk to everyone later. Okay, bye.